politics as usual simply is incapable of responding to the greatest predicament humankind has ever faced, which is the gathering collapse of our life support systems. You might have hoped that with all the promises of representation that are made to us, that when a really great crisis, a massive crisis, the biggest crisis there's ever been, came along, that they would step up and say, "We are here to save you." They are completely incapable of doing so, partly because they are so enmeshed in the system that is causing this enormous crisis. They are enmeshed in the system of consumerism, of neoliberalism, of capitalism that is driving the world into ruin. We know that we have no chance of avoiding climate breakdown unless we already now start retiring fossil fuel infrastructure. That means oil rigs, that means coal mines, that means gas plants, that means pipelines, that means roads, that means airports. We have to start closing them down already. This is what the science tells us. It's not just that we can't afford any more fossil infrastructure. We cannot afford the fossil infrastructure we already have. Yet, the fossil fuel companies are intending to accelerate investments over the next 10 years. They're intending to put $5 trillion extra dollars into developing new oil and gas fields across the next 10 years. We can't afford even $1 of that investment. We need minus investments, disinvestment from fossil fuels, not this massive increase in investment. And you might have hoped that those who claim to represent us, that those who claim to represent our interests in institutions like the one down the road, would pull out all the stops to prevent the habitable planet from sliding over the precipice. But far from doing so, these people are doing everything they can, at least the current government is doing everything it can to accelerate that disaster. For example, by overriding local people and local authorities to impose fracking licenses. Do we want that?
No!
Do we want an end to all fracking?
Yes!
Do we want an end to fossil fuel exploitation altogether?
Yes!
Do we want to keep fossil fuels in the ground?
Yes!
Is this government going to deliver that?
No!
This is why we need a new politics. We need a politics of the kind that they keep saying they want us to have. Taking back control, popular sovereignty. Isn't it fascinating how the whole Brexit thing was supposed to be giving power back to the people? Well, first of all, they deny power to Parliament because they say Parliament is opposed to popular sovereignty. Fine, okay, we can live with that as long as you then give power to us through participatory democracy. No chance. They're not giving us even a shred of that. Their notion of popular sovereignty is total control by Johnson and Cummings and the rest of their cabal. That's the very opposite of popular sovereignty and the very opposite of the approach that we require if we're to pull ourselves out of this existential mess. Now, they tell us that our demands are politically unrealistic. They say it's impossible. We can't decarbonise by 2025. That's just off the scale, ridiculous, unrealistic. Well, if there's one thing we've learned about political realism over the past 3 years, is that it changes somewhat from one month to the next. And what appeared to be politically impossible one moment suddenly and mysteriously becomes possible the next. They told us Brexit was impossible. Well, maybe it is, but they told us that the vote for Brexit was impossible. They told us the election of Donald Trump was impossible. It's all impossible until it suddenly becomes possible, and then it happens. And so if we want to bargain with realisms, the one we are constrained by is not going to be political realism, it must be scientific realism.
Yes.
While you can bargain with politics, you cannot bargain with physics. You cannot prorogue the laws of thermodynamics, decide that for a few years they're not going to apply. You cannot decide to ignore scientific reality and expect the world to carry on as it is. We should repurpose that old situationist slogan from 50 years ago. Be realistic, demand the impossible. We should repurpose it. Be scientifically realistic, demand the politically impossible. And when we demand it, and demand it in sufficient numbers, with sufficient numbers behind us, with sufficient determination of people prepared to hold the streets, what is politically impossible suddenly becomes not just possible, but inevitable. We are seeing right in front of our eyes the beginning of inevitability, the beginning of the political transformation, the great shift required in our political lives, which will match the huge predicament that we now face. We are seeing the beginnings of popular sovereignty that will get us out of this death spiral and put the planet back onto the course it needs to be on if it is to remain habitable. And this transformation is called Extinction Rebellion. We rebel against extinction. We rebel for life. And in rebelling, we rebel not just for our own lives, we rebel for the lives of everyone who is not here yet, but maybe soon will be. We rebel for the lives of those who are yet to be born, and we rebel for the lives of all the other wonderful species that inhabit this fantastic planet of ours. The only planet so far known to harbour life. We rebel for this precious sphere, this beautiful, astonishing place that we are lucky enough to be brought up into. And we rebel to ensure that other people can continue to thrive and prosper on this planet. Now, we know that the current power structures are like a loaded gun pointed at the survivability of the current planet, of the healthy planet. A professor in Canada, Kevin Mackay, has produced a very interesting analysis which shows that what societies that have collapsed had in common was not necessarily extreme complexity, which some people propose as being the primary driver of collapse, was not necessarily a loss of energy, of physical energy, which some people say is a primary driver. What all those collapsed societies had in common was control by an oligarchy. Because even if everybody else in society could see that there was a problem that needed to be addressed, the oligarchy had a vested interest, a short-term interest, in sustaining the system that led to ruin. And what do we see in control today? We see an oligarchy. We see a system that calls itself democracy, but functions more like plutocracy. A system that is comprehensively corrupted by the money of elites, the money of oligarchs, the money of corporations, which have turned what should be a system that responds to us, a democratic system, into a system that responds to them. And those huge investments being made by the fossil fuel companies, those have been permitted because those fossil fuel companies, through our profoundly corrupt political funding laws, have been able to buy political influence all around the world. And we have an oligarchy represented by the billionaire press, represented by the billionaire financiers and of course by the billionaire fossil fuel owners, which is effectively determining the current political course. It is from them that we need to take back control. Otherwise, we will go in the same direction as those other societies that Kevin Mackay studied. The oligarchy will destroy us. So our campaign is an environmental campaign, but it's also a political campaign. It is a campaign for justice, for political justice, for social justice, for equality, for justice for the unborn, for justice for the other species with which we share this planet. We cannot allow ourselves to be boxed in to a narrow campaign. We must see ourselves as connected to all the attempts to make this a better and happier world. When people are oppressed, we are oppressed. When other species are destroyed, we are destroyed. When our life support systems are compromised, we too are compromised. So we join together with people around the world to fight the forces destroying us. And in so doing, we create a world fit for its people and fit for the other species with which we share it. We rebel against life. We rebel for life, rebel against extinction. Oh my God, what did I say? Perhaps we should stop calling this the sixth great extinction, because that makes it sound like a natural process similar to those that took place before. I think it's time to call it the first great extermination. That is what we're doing. And while all of us, because we are embedded in the system, are party to that extermination, it is driven primarily by existing power structures, the power structures we must overthrow. We are constantly set apart by those structures. We are atomized. We are told we are alone and should be alone. There's a word for that ideology. It's called consumerism. And it is the most powerful ideology of our times. So powerful that we don't even recognize it as an ideology. And what consumerism says is it's not up to people to come together and create structural or systemic change. It's up to each one of us to make individual choices. And that's going to change the world. We know that does not work. There is no such thing as green consumerism. But the consumerist ideology says we are apart and must remain apart. The consumerist ideology blames individuals for a systemic and structural problem. The consumerist ideology says if you come to an event like this and you're middle class, you're a champagne socialist. If you're working class, it's the politics of envy. If you wear leather shoes, you're a hypocrite. If you don't, you're a hippie. We're not allowed to win. Everyone apparently is disqualified from challenging the system. We do not accept that disqualification. We are uncooperative crusties and we're proud of it. Uncooperative! Uncooperative! As uncooperative crusties, we do not accept the individuation of responsibility. We do not accept the atomization of society. We come together to change the world. And we change it in the spirit of the most embarrassing word in the English language, a word you will very seldom hear mentioned in the Houses of Parliament: love. We come together in love for each other, in love for the rest of the living world, in love for the better people that we will become. We come together in love for all those who have not yet joined us, but to whom we now reach out. We reach out to them with the antithesis of neoliberalism, the antithesis of consumerism, which is that meeting of hearts called empathy, that empathy that leads to love. In doing so, we rebel against extinction. We rebel for life. We rebel for love. Extinction! 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 Thank you.